Good morning, afternoon, or evening, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners, wherever you are around the world. Today, we have esteemed congressional reporter for The Hill, Emily Brooks, joining us. She's a friend of the show, and she's also an expert on the GOP conference, what just happened with the Speaker McCarthy vote, and how this sets up for the future. What are the priorities of the party? What is governing going to look like? So on and so forth. So Emily, first, I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your evening to join us and basically explain your reporting on what you just witnessed.
Yeah, I think that what happened on the House floor last week, and especially Friday, was a surprise to anybody who was watching. I think a lot of us predicted that there would be multiple ballots for speaker, but didn't really know what was going to happen beyond that. And even a lot of Republican members I was talking to, even about halfway through the week, were not sure exactly what was going to happen and how things were going to play out, if McCarthy would indeed pull out the speakership, which of course he did. And that Friday night, late night into Saturday morning, the 14th ballot, when McCarthy and his allies thought maybe they would win that one, and then he didn't, and then they moved to adjourn, and then at the very last second, they had 218 votes to adjourn, and then they said, okay, let's go one more time, and everybody went running up to the well of the House with their red cards because they had already electronically cast their ballots to change it to not adjourn so they could go one more time when he finally got it. It was the most dramatic thing I've ever seen on the House floor, aside from January 6, 2021.
The dispute over Kevin McCarthy's speakership bid led to a physical altercation on the floor of the House, where one member put his hands on the face of another member, Mike Rogers of Alabama. And we were speaking before we started recording about the extraordinary access we had to the dynamics in the room because of these free C-SPAN cameras. And so viewers around the country were able to see maybe what some of these congressional dynamics are in a way that they never had before. But it leaves us wondering, is this sort of explosive outburst typical in Congress? Maybe not on the House floor, but behind closed doors during the conference meetings and so on. Is it really that extraordinary, or do we see these kinds of things happening in Congress, in private offices and in caucus meetings? How do people in the GOP caucus kind of feel about this incident with a few days of space?
Well, certainly people are not coming to blows or almost coming to blows frequently. That was a pretty extraordinary circumstance. That was not only the speakership election was rivaling some of those records from the 1800s, but it seemed like we were almost going back to the 1800s with what was happening with members on the floor. There are, of course, some tense moments that I've heard about behind closed doors, and people do get frustrated in conference meetings. Sometimes it sounds more dramatic written on a page than it does. Members felt it does in the actual meeting. But yeah, there are a lot of frustrations that go on. But this was definitely something like I have not seen before in terms of frustration with the GOP conference. I mean, this was bubbling for months. People were tired. It was very late at night. Wesley Hunt, a new member from Texas, had flown back to be there for the vote and left his wife and premature born son in the hospital to be there. And so there was definitely a lot of frustration about being there. It's not clear if we're going to see any more of that on future votes. They've made a lot of promises, so we'll see what happens.
And with this extremely divisive and explosive fight for the speakership behind us, especially thinking of how slim a majority the Republicans do have, there have to be some questions about the extent to which the leadership and the whips really have control of the conference at all. McCarthy's been vindicated in some way because he did get the gavel, but do he and his team really feel like they have control of the conference going into the next Congress?
Well, of course, outwardly, they are saying that they do. The first major test of that was the House rules package that passed on Monday evening, there was some concern about whether some of the more moderate or centrist members would support that, given the frustration about being locked out of a lot of those closed door negotiations with the 20 members who were withholding support for McCarthy. But it passed with only one Republican defection, Tony Gonzalez of Texas. And a lot of them have said that they are supportive of a lot of the things that were agreed to from those negotiations. When it comes down to some of these actual votes that might be coming up, for example, a term limits bill, some budgetary items, some fights that are looming about the debt ceiling that we're already talking about months in advance, it could get a little bit trickier for a lot of those more moderate members. And also now that these, Freedom Caucus type Republicans seem more empowered and feel more empowered, the question is, how much further are they going to go? Are the concessions that they got good enough? Are they going to push even harder? How McCarthy executes a lot of these? Is that going to be good enough for them? And so it was tricky for even Nancy Pelosi when she had a lot more tools to control how the House was operating in the last Congress. There were, if you and your listeners recall, the Build Back Better bill, that was stalled multiple times on the House floor. And there were hours and hours on the House floor when they left open a vote, when they were having negotiations and trying to figure that out. And that was basically the same margin that Republicans have now. And in general, they seemed like they were a lot more unified in a lot of this stuff than the Republican conferences. So I'm definitely expecting that, especially in a lot of these budgetary items, it could be really tough for the whips and the leadership.
I just want to quickly shift gears a little bit before getting into the moderates and focus on Steve Scalise and Elise Stefanik. So during this fight, we heard a lot of names referenced. It was Patrick McHenry, Bruce Westerman, folks that maybe generally don't get national media attention, but they were the ones getting the credit or blame for negotiating with these 20 hardliners. They were the ones moving the chess pieces around on the board. And we really only heard Steve Scalise's name when it was surfaced by maybe some of his allies, suggesting that he could be an alternative to Kevin McCarthy. So the big question is, did Scalise, did Stefanik do anything behind the scenes materially to advance Kevin McCarthy's speakership? And does Kevin McCarthy actually trust these folks as much as maybe the lesser known Westerman and McHenry?
I think that the people who are in McCarthy's inner circle are kind of names like you said. Patrick McHenry, Garrett Graves was instrumental in negotiating with those 20 holdouts. Also, French Hill was instrumental. Those were the three really big negotiators with McCarthy, along with Tom Emmer. Scalise was supportive, but he was not really in the middle of it. Neither was Elise Stefanik. They were kind of staying a little bit out of it on the sidelines and giving, nominating speeches for Kevin McCarthy, definitely not making any moves to oppose him or anything behind the scenes to oppose him. But that was that they were not really, from what I saw and what I heard from members, part of that inner circle.
So, Emily, we saw the kind of list of concessions that McCarthy gave to the holdouts, and it was things like committee seats, rule changes, the select committees. And looking at some of them, we wonder if they're really big giveaways. A lot of analysts have said that the motion to vacate is a bit overstated. It might not be as big of a threat to McCarthy's speakership as it's being presented as being. The select committee doesn't seem as though McCarthy gave that away with too much reluctance. Were the committee seats really the big prize? Is that really what this was all about?
Well, as we're recording this, it's unclear exactly what the makeup of the committee seats will be. The steering committee is going to decide that. The only thing that I have heard has been promised is about 2 to 3 seats on the House Rules Committee, which is really important for those holdouts because the House Rules Committee controls everything that comes to the House floor, whether or not other rules on things like the budget are waived. And so if they have enough seats on the House Rules Committee, they can block certain items and certain things from being waived. So that could be really interesting to see how that plays out. From what I understand, that promise is either Freedom Caucus or Freedom Caucus adjacent members, which could mean a whole bunch of things. It could be somebody like Thomas Massie, who is not technically in the Freedom Caucus. It could be somebody like Jeff Duncan, who supported McCarthy through a lot of these ballots. Or it could be somebody like Chip Roy, who volunteered himself to be on the committee, even though he said he doesn't want to leave his wife and kids on Sundays in order to make it back to Washington on those days. I think that's the biggest thing. The motion to vacate, I think, even though it went for a really long time, I can't remember the year before it was used in 2015 against Speaker Boehner, but it was really a rare motion. And while McCarthy did ultimately cave to that, and it might not ever be used in this Congress, that threat is looming over him. And it's also important because McCarthy and his allies worked against lowering down that threshold to one member. Originally, it was half of the Republican conference would be needed in order to bring that motion up. That was something that they passed in November in their internal rules. And then on New Year's Day, they released the rules package. McCarthy had agreed to limit that to 5 members, which was the number of members that would be needed to basically tank anything on the House floor from the Republican caucus, and the number of members who were publicly saying we are not going to vote for Kevin McCarthy for Speaker. And so, but what is really the argument I was hearing from a lot of those holdouts was, what is really the actual difference between 5 and 1? It's not really that huge. Another argument I was hearing from the McCarthy camp was, well, we don't want the Democrats to be able to make a motion to vacate, but it's essentially going back to the way that things were before Democrats took back control of the House in 2019. So will that be used? That threat is looming over him. It's possible. But right now, all of the holdouts seem pretty happy. We'll see if that sticks.
Emily, so just to follow up on that, you mentioned that the motion to vacate was the big thing. And realistically speaking, based on the rules package that, I don't know if it was public, but the rules package that was in writing before the voting and the changes that were made after the voting, it seems like only the motion to vacate was changed from 1 to 5. A one-person motion to vacate is useless because that can be dispensed with pretty easily. So I just wanted to kind of follow back up on Chip Roy and his gang of, 14, 13, Matt Gaetz, his gang of 5 or 6. It seems to me like it's basically committee assignments. And it was really all, I understand the Rules Committee is very important, but the only true concessions, if there were no changes to the Rules Committee, if the select committees on China, government weaponization, Afghanistan, and other select committees were already agreed to, and the only changes you have are people arguing for committee seats, like Matt Gaetz allegedly arguing for an armed services seat. Can we just boil this down to these 20 members are all very similar in the way they were thinking? They saw this as an opportunity to leverage their power and ultimately advance their personal careers, as opposed to any big stand on changing the rules.
Well, I will say that the Freedom Caucus has always been about using the tools at your disposal to exert as much leverage as possible in order to get what you want. And whether that's on spending, whether that's on the structure of certain things. And so this was essentially the Freedom Caucus on full display, utilizing that. As far as the committee assignments, I have heard over and over from both people on the McCarthy side and people on the holdout side that there were not committee seats promised because McCarthy can't individually make that promise. That is a decision for the House GOP Steering Committee, which is a panel of about 30 Republican members that makes those committee assignments and chairmanship assignments. However, most of those are McCarthy allies. So they will probably follow his lead. And also he gets 4 votes on that compared to 1 for everybody else. And Scalise gets 2. So will there be more people on committees that they want? Probably. One thing that we already saw over the weekend was McCarthy designated Byron Donalds, who was voted for McCarthy on the first 2 ballots before becoming a holdout. He made him his designee to be on the House GOP steering committee. So that was pretty interesting. And one of the committee chairman races that was decided was Mark Green, is a member of the House Freedom Caucus. He was a supporter of McCarthy, but he is going to be chair of the Homeland Security Committee. So that is a win for the Freedom Caucus, and Andy Biggs immediately celebrated upon announcement of that chairmanship. So we're going to see exactly how many people will be on the committees. I know Marjorie Taylor Greene has been angling to get on the House Oversight Committee for a long time. And she says also that she has not been promised anything, but you can be not promised something, but also if something doesn't happen, can be pretty upset.
You're giving us a straight reporting, so we appreciate that. It's just tough to square Marjorie Taylor Greene's complete 180 on Kevin McCarthy and then being the largest supporter of Kevin McCarthy without her getting a committee seat when that's the only thing she's been focused on, right, Emily? So it's difficult to kind of work through this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's she keeps on saying she's not been promised anything. I can't report on anything that she's been promised, but I'd be very surprised if she does not get a pretty good committee seat that she wants.
Just to follow up, so you started out this line of discussion that we're having right now with Nancy Mace grumbling about the rules package, Tony Gonzalez, both former guests on our show, voting against the rules package. I guess the follow-up here is when I worked for Congressman Tim Kielskamp during the last speaker putsch, or whatever we want to call it, in 2015, the common refrain, moderate wasn't really ideology, it was willingness to fight. And they viewed the moderates as these squishy folks. Like Kevin McCarthy was considered a moderate because he was kind of viewed as potentially being willing to compromise on everything, even though he may be more conservative, generally speaking. So the follow-up here is, it sounds like Mark Green was a big concession. It sounds like Jason Smith is a conservative, self-branded, firebrand populist who's now the Ways and Means Committee chairperson. Will the moderates, when they're losing this power to the more conservative firebrand folks, actually do anything other than grumble? Is there a red line that could be crossed where the moderates will stand up to these conservatives and regain some of that leverage?
Well, 2 things. Number one, I would say that Jason Smith is a big McCarthy ally, so that wasn't necessarily a concession for his chairmanship. He was in the room with McCarthy on election night, so there's that. But as far as whether moderates, which they don't like to be called moderates, that's sort of a dirty word now. I get complaints if I call certain caucuses moderate. Now they are, because they're conservatives. They just are pragmatic. Pragmatic is the word that they like now. But that sort of sphere of lawmakers, I have yet to see them exert the same kind of will that the Freedom Caucus has, or tactical type of willingness to go against what leadership is saying or doing and take a real stand. Because, I mean, there were things from some of the caucuses or members from some of the caucuses, like the Main Street Caucus, like the Republican Governance Group, formerly known as the Tuesday Group, saying that they were not going to really support certain concessions like the motion to vacate if they were lowered. They were not happy with that. The members of the Main Street Caucus said that they were not going to continue their support of McCarthy, or not. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but they were not going to continue their support of certain rules changes if McCarthy was not speedily elected to be speaker. And what did they do? Nothing. We have only had one defection on the House rules package. Will that change in the future when it's not really the stakes of the House Speaker, the House rules establishing them being able to do whatever, like anything, essentially? Maybe that will change, but I'm not sure.
And Emily, another controversy around this list of concessions that McCarthy gave to the holdouts has to do with the dispute about a possible 3-page secret document, an addendum to the rules package that no one in the press supposedly has seen. There's disputes about whether it even exists. What's the truth here? Is there a secret 3-page document? If so, what's in it and why the dispute about its existence?
Well, from what I've heard today, there is no secret 3-page addendum, but they have written certain things down that were not in the rules that were agreed to, but we haven't seen it. So do those all add up to 3 pages? I'm not sure. One thing is sure is that last week during these negotiations, people like Ralph Norman, who was a key McCarthy holdout, said that they were looking for certain commitments in writing. And they went into Tom Emmer's office where these negotiations were happening and said, I have seen this paper in writing and I am happy with it. They were trying to nail it down. Something does exist in writing, and we have gotten a lot of information from various different comments, from various different bulleted lists. Actually, Anna Paulina Luna, who is a new member from Florida, put out a actually very helpful bulleted list of a lot of concessions from Leader McCarthy on Twitter. And a couple of them have put it out in press statements. A lot of those things are things that were already in the rules. I mean, some of the things they're taking credit for were agreed to by Leader McCarthy before this whole speaker fight, like the select subcommittee on the weaponization of federal government under the House Judiciary Committee, like things like the Holman Rule, which allows amendments to reduce federal employee salaries down to $1 and essentially defunding them. That was something that was previously in House rules under Republicans when they last controlled the chamber. So some of these things that they were asking for weren't huge asks, but they are taking credit for it. But the big things are certain bills coming to being able to go through the committee process, potentially to the floors with Leader Scalise was kind of qualifying that today, that they are allowed to go through the process while they come to the floor, to be determined, committee structure and makeup, and sort of commitments on having a budget set on fiscal 2022 levels for discretionary spending, and kind of a commitment to really play hardball on a lot of budgetary measures. And that was something that a lot of these members were looking for. I feel like we're going back to kind of the 2010 Tea Party wave, and there might be a debt limit budget battle that's similar to 2011 coming up.
And that's actually where we're going to go with a couple questions. But before we get there, I've seen in the media, specifically, center-left media like CNN, MSNBC, a lot has been made of the Holman Rule and how this could be used to prevent, for example, just defund the whole FBI or defund the whole IRS. But I just wanted to clearly ask you, the House cannot unilaterally pass laws and sign those laws into existence, right? Any type of Holman Rule that is targeting a federal employee needs to be passed through the Senate and then signed into law by the president. So it seems like this is more a messaging thing that maybe some in the media don't understand and are hyping up, and also something that is very unlikely to be used. Is that an accurate assessment, or where do you fall?
I think that's pretty accurate. It really depends on how hardball that Speaker McCarthy will play with a lot of these budgetary measures. He said he's going to try to pass 12 individual appropriations bills like they're supposed to. That's only happened 3 times since that kind of structure has been implemented, and not since 1997 on time. when it comes to things like the Holman rule, what exact individuals or departments would they defund? And would that ever be accepted in negotiation with a Democratic-controlled Senate? And that could be signed by the Biden White House. And would the big question is, would Republicans in the House be willing to accept or risk a government shutdown if those demands aren't met? Those are a lot of big unknowns, and it's gonna be hard to see how that significantly impacts any federal agencies as a whole or individual programs. Some of the individuals that they have talked about defunding are people like Anthony Fauci, who is not in government anymore. I don't see a huge impact, but it could lead to a lot of fights and a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, let's get into the budget stuff. So you adroitly pointed out one of the requests or requirements was to roll back FY24 funding to FY22 funding. What does that mean for people? FY22 funding was roughly $1.47 trillion and FY23 funding was 1.7. So that's a sizable cut of, if my math is right, $230 billion from the budget. If there's no agreement, for folks in the audience, that means we have a government shutdown. The question basically is, does Kevin McCarthy care about finding a bipartisan solution? And I ask because the concessions he's made on the Rules Committee, the concessions he's made on the motion to vacate were largely to Chip Roy, who architected the 2013 Ted Cruz Obamacare shutdown, which was a political stunt and was never going to go anywhere. So has Kevin McCarthy created a situation where if he were to try and pass bipartisan legislation, that ultimately what would happen is he'd lose his speakership position? Or does he just not care about the budget? How should we understand these concessions in concert with the House Freedom Caucus holding all the cards here?
I'm not 100% sure that Speaker McCarthy has a plan on how he's going to handle this. I do know that he was not going to get the speakership unless he made these concessions. It could be possible that I'm just theorizing here, that we see a scenario to where he tries, but then it gets right down to it and the House GOP doesn't quite go through with exactly everything that was agreed to, but he still survives his speakership until at least the end of his term. That's going to be tough. And what exactly are they going to cut? There's been a lot of talk about defense spending. There have been some members who said, no, we're not cutting defense spending. That was not part of our talks. We're talking, the way that Chip Roy has described it is saying fiscal 2022 levels, but not necessarily every single department and program at those levels. Just as a whole, you put it all together and it's adds up to 1.47 trillion or whatever the number is. And maybe defense stays or goes up and they cut more things or whatever. But that's just like a lot to figure out, right? And there you have other members saying, well, maybe there are some things in defense that could be spent better, etc. It's going to be a lot of heartache, I think, for a lot of members if they actually want to meet that goal.
And it sounds like there isn't any plan right now other than we just have to get through the speaker vote and the rules package. We've just done that. So taking away leadership, taking away this cohesive plan, from your experience reporting on the GOP conference, on Washington, D.C., these hardliners have made very clear that they, at least publicly, would like to shut down the government if they can't get concessions. Should we take these people seriously? Are they willing to actually shut down the government? Because they have the leverage based on the votes.
I think that they should be taken seriously. The question is whether they would go that far if they feel like they've gotten enough from sort of the other concessions that they have had. This whole speakership fight was about a lot of these concessions, about a lot of these priorities, securing these commitments, making sure their focus was in certain areas that they've been talking about for a long time. I mean, the first time the Freedom Caucus released this list of demands was in July. So a lot of this is not particularly new. But the whole game with these negotiations, and the Freedom Caucus and these holdouts understand this, is that you don't necessarily get every single thing they want. They didn't get every single line item they want, or every single line item exactly the way they wanted it, but they got enough to where they thought they could accept it. You always, ask for more than what you want if you're trying to do a salary negotiation or something like that, right? So they're sort of going the same way. Are they going to take the same attitude towards these concessions that they did secure on this piece of paper that may or may not exist? I'm not sure. Well, it's a very dynamic situation now. And there might be a little bit of fatigue, I think, with the rest of the Republican conference if every single vote on every single appropriations bill or every single measure turns into this drawn out fight and they can't pass anything. We were, of course, expecting House GOP to be led with a major focus on investigations, which doesn't take a vote on the floor. So, of course, they're going to be able to do a whole lot of that. But there are certain things that need to be done, like passing a federal budget. There's the farm bill this year. There's FAA reauthorization this year. So there's going to be a lot of major pieces on the floor this year.
Emily, you talked about looking for areas where the Republicans would actually target for budget cuts, talking about defense spending. One area that some members have indicated could be a focus is the popular entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We know that Rick Scott last year infamously put out a plan that suggested that he wanted to touch those. We saw this week Representative Michael Waltz went on television and talked about trying to touch those. And we remember when this was a focus back in 2011, like you said, the last time there was this big fight over the debt ceiling, and how unpopular it was and how poorly received it was and how it perhaps led to a poor election outcome in 2012. Looking at the possibility of this playing out again, like it did in 2011, you have to kind of wonder a little bit about what the rationale is here, given that history. And I think there's maybe three possibilities, and I want to hear which one you think it might be. The first is that they believe that this is smart politics. And, you kind of have to question that considering what happened in 2011 and how popular those programs are. The second is that this is really kind of the most sincere ideological belief about government. You can see how it has been kind of a through line since the New Deal, interest in addressing those programs, changing those programs. And this is really just a completely sincere, very honest idea about what government should do. That's a big part of the GOP kind of ideology. And then the third is that maybe it's just a matter of lack of creativity. We know that Kevin McCarthy isn't the most creative, dynamic leader that the Republicans have ever had. And maybe his only idea about what to do is just kind of replay the same playbook the last time the Republicans had a House majority. So those are all kind of different things. Maybe there's some overlap, but looking at them potentially retrying a strategy that backfired so much, I'm wondering which of those three things might be pushing them in that direction.
I would say number two, the sincere belief that they really think that they need to reform entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But one thing that Chip Roy has been saying is that everything that he's secured with commitments about fiscal 2022 levels is all discretionary spending that is not mandatory spending that applies to Social Security and Medicare. Me and my colleagues are still trying to figure out, as of this week and as of today, where exactly the rest of the GOP conference stands on this. I do not think that a lot of these commitments are necessarily about those programs in general. I don't really expect a lot of major action on those programs in general. What we could see, though, is that they want to pass a budget that balances in 10 years, which is something that the conservative Republican Study Committee, the largest conservative caucus in the House, has put out every year, essentially. Those regularly include things like reforming Social Security, raising the retirement age, maybe some kind of means testing could be part of that. All of the Republicans I've talked to this week about this say that they wouldn't really want to do anything that wasn't on a broadly bipartisan basis or some kind of agreement with Biden or the Democrats. Of course, I don't think that's going to happen in the next 2 years, but they're expecting that this is going to have to be addressed in some way eventually, and they want to be ready. So that's what could be coming up. But again, all of these things that House GOP may pass are not going to pass in a Democratic Senate. If it cuts Social Security or Medicare, President Biden is not going to sign it. It's very hard to make any major changes to those entitlement programs.
And John and I were disagreeing about this vociferously before we got on the call. Emily, I'm with you. It doesn't sound like to me it makes any sense for the GOP conference to push for entitlement cuts going into a presidential election cycle. So it sounds like maybe these were just kind of one-offs by Scalise when he talks about entitlements and Michael Waltz in these press conferences.
Whether it makes sense is a different question than the question of whether or not they'll do it.
Well, they just lived through this. And Emily, please jump in here. They just lived through this with Paul Ryan. They couldn't even get support under unified Republican control in the Senate, White House, and House of Representatives for Paul Ryan's baby. He's been trying to reform this for a decade, I think. And that's why he got all these, he's a policy wonk in all these committees. So John, I think that we're maybe taking two comments from two members and ascribing it to the whole conference, maybe.
Well, we're certainly seeing a lot of indications that they're looking for a debt ceiling fight. And if they want to push for a balanced budget and if they want a debt ceiling fight, then I think that entitlements are going to end up being a part of the conversation as they have been.
I think that all of the members recognize at some level, if you really kind of talk to them about it, that you cannot balance the budget without doing something on entitlements. Will that pass? I'm going to predict no. I'm comfortable enough to make a prediction. I'm usually not, but I'm predicting that they will not do something over the next 2 years. Now, if they do get unified control of government in the future, I don't know.
And again, Justin, the fact that it's not feasible and that it doesn't seem like good political strategy absolutely does not mean that it's not something they're going to pursue.
Touche. This is a good, lively conversation. I'll take all of your points into advisement as we discuss this issue moving forward. Emily, I want to just piggyback off of what we're talking about. And you can't predict the future. I know that. But we do know there's probably going to be a fight over the debt limit and also the budget, which are two different things. And I feel like a significant portion of those 20 members didn't realize that because of the way they talk about each of them and they kind of lump them together. But that's just an aside. Let's say the Freedom Caucus does dig in, and there's 30 or 40 members in that, and they do want to potentially default on the debt, right? And we were discussing the moderates. Is there any possibility through, I don't want to say hijacking, through sinking a special rule, which is a procedure in the House, which needs a simple majority and is much faster than a discharge petition, or through a discharge petition, where 5 or 6 moderate Republicans or pragmatic Republicans work with Democrats to advance a piece of legislation that ultimately avoids debt default, for example, just using one of those. Brian Fitzpatrick mentioned that he's open to that. Do you see any appetite? Is there this possibility, or am I in fantasy land thinking that we'll ultimately avoid the worst?
Well, I will say that for something like a discharge petition, we don't see that used successfully very often. So that would have to be a very rare and serious circumstance. But the debt limit, if there's enough nervousness, I think with Wall Street, with financial institutions, I mean, when you have markets reacting to uncertainty in Washington about something like the debt limit that actually affects Americans' retirement programs, it affects their pocketbooks. And that's something that Republicans like that Brian Fitzpatrick really care about. So if there's anything that could have a small group of the more moderate Republicans band together and work with Democrats to kind of pass, it would be probably something like the debt limit. That's really hard to predict because we don't know what exactly the negotiations are going to entail and how far things will get before, how far essentially Speaker McCarthy will press to try and link some kind of spending reduction to the debt limit. Of course, we did see Leader McConnell in the last Congress, who was not necessarily a favorite of the Freedom Caucus and those holdouts. In fact, he sort of villainized a lot. He did use the debt limit as a bargaining chip for when Democrats were trying to pass their Build Back Better bill, and he said that you are not going to do this. You're not going to raise the debt limit with the help of Republican votes so long as you are pursuing that. So, of course, Republicans have the majority in the House, so it's going to be a little bit different. I don't know. That could be a scenario, but I think it's a little bit too far out at this point to know exactly.
Well, we will obviously have to have you back once these talks heat up because it'll hijack national news for weeks, I have a feeling about. But to kind of transition away from the debt ceiling, away from the spending bills, and more broadly into McCarthy's agenda, and then we'll hit on the special committees. I think John wants to get into that. But McCarthy's agenda. So the first non-rules vote was defunding 87,000 employees at the IRS their salary. And next version of a legislation is they want to abolish the IRS and abolish federal income tax as two examples. And then we have all of these committees that we will get into. These messaging bills are done by both parties. The Democrats had it with H.R. 1 and voting rights. But this is just a long way to set up a question. I haven't heard of any serious priorities put forward by the Republicans, by Speaker McCarthy, that could have any possibility of passing and being signed into law. Does McCarthy want to govern seriously? And does he have a legislative agenda that he has made known to his conference and to reporters? Or is this more going to be 2 terms of messaging?
I think it's going to be a lot of messaging. This 2 years is going to be a lot of setting up the 2024 presidential election. But the thing that I hear from McCarthy's office, McCarthy's allies, and that they are most optimistic about in terms of having some bipartisan agreement and broad support is their select committee that they have created on China and China policy. And that actually passed with broad support from Democrats, which I don't know what I was expecting. I was personally a little bit surprised by that. But there is a major appetite to do a lot more things that were in something like the CHIPS and Science bill that passed in the last Congress, doing a lot about addressing China buying up a lot of agricultural lands in the United States. They want to address Chinese influence with things like TikTok and things like influence in universities across the United States. And so I think there's a lot of bipartisan interest in that. And they're very optimistic about getting something more done on that. If there's one area where Republicans and Democrats can work together in this House, that will probably be it.
It is funny how sometimes some of our biggest mistakes on global affairs have been on matters where there is a bipartisan consensus. So we'll see. We'll see where that leads. Emily, because we just have a little bit of time left, we wanted to ask you about the select committee and the investigatory posture of the incoming Congress generally. This is something that obviously creates a real challenge for the press, for commentators, for pundits, for journalists, because we remember McCarthy's admission from 2015 that some of the investigations that they pursued were a bit pretextual, that they were politically motivated, that the purpose of the investigations was to damage Hillary Clinton's candidacy politically. And we also saw the attitude that many of these members like Jim Jordan and others took during concerning corruption scandals in the last presidency. So we know that these committees and investigations are being launched with questionable good faith. And it's a real challenge to figure out how to cover those, knowing that they're not necessarily something that we can really take at face value or honestly. So how are you planning to approach these investigations with all of that in mind?
Well, that's a really great question and something I've been talking with my editors about a lot. And with my team a lot. I mean, we do have a team of reporters at the Hill who are on Capitol Hill every single day, and people who are covering things like the Justice Department a lot closer than I am. So I'm definitely going to be leaning on them for a lot of this. And yes, I mean, when either side, but yes, when Republicans say something they've received in a document or that they've unveiled, you always have to double check. Sometimes it's something that's old information. Sometimes it's something that's missing context. But then, at a lot of these things, there are things like in the Biden family investigation that James Comer is doing, for example, there are legitimate questions about how much should family members of former presidents be involved in business dealings with foreign countries that are adversaries, and does that matter? Is there anything that Congress can do to address that? So there, of course, is going to be a lot of salacious things that come out, I'm sure. It's tricky, and sometimes things will come out in a big report or an investigation, and it'll take me and my colleagues a little bit of time to actually read it and go through it, pick out the parts that are really important, and try and, every time you get a piece of information and you have to try and fact check it, it takes a little bit of time. And so that's not, of course, what the politicians want. They want you to take exactly what they hand you and just run with it. But it's gonna be tough, and it's tough in either party, but it's definitely gonna be tough in this Republican House.
Yeah, I'm sure that hopefully everyone here and most people listening would certainly share concern about how family members of presidents conduct overseas business while their family member controls so much of U.S. policy. It was certainly a concern that we had in the last presidency, and I think in that situation, a much more significant concern, considering that some of those family members had positions in the White House and public policy portfolios that were directly impacting their own business interests. And we saw how they made decisions according to those conflicts of interest. And it is strange to see that there was almost no curiosity about any of those matters from figures like Jordan. I mean, we welcome him a little bit late to the party of being concerned about the families of presidents. And just like you said, Emily, there is plenty to be concerned about one of President Biden's family members at least. But I think we have to continue to note that lack of curiosity in the past.
Oh, I would say just absolutely. Members of political parties are very rarely, if ever, going to criticize other members of their own political party if there's nothing to be gained from it. And that's one of the cardinal rules of politics. That's one of the tough parts of having parties in a representative government and in a democracy, really.
I suppose in 1974, we did get to the point where the Republican Party went to the White House and told Nixon that he had to resign. A limited amount has changed since that time. I mean, that was a time of partisan polarization too. And, there was lots of anxiety over the Cold War. There was plenty of government corruption, even things that we've only learned about subsequently, abuses that partisans did overlook. But they still did eventually get to that point. And you wonder if they could get to that point again.
I have another question, and I just want to add in, there are legitimate concerns with Hunter Biden, like potential tax fraud and other things that are completely separate from this, political polarization. But bringing up political parties kind of eating their own in a ethical way, right? I just phrase that in a weird way. But Al Franken and the Democrats, right? There were allegations that some would think were anodyne, but he ultimately got eaten up by his political party because the members of that party thought he was immoral and he was acting in a way that is not representative of a U.S. senator. Conversely, we have George Santos, and he is considered to be maybe the biggest fraud ever in federal U.S. elected office. He's been accused of credibly lying about almost everything. And we saw that, I think it was Speaker McCarthy said that he's going to handle this internally. Do you have any light that you can shed on this? Is he always going to be a member of Congress? And is his vote just too important where they don't care if he's a fraud? Like, what's going to happen?
I don't know what's going to happen to George Santos. I will say that in previous instances where there is a member of Congress who is involved in an ethics issue, an illegal issue, campaign finance issue, usually the response is to let the federal investigative authorities or whatever investigative authority do their part and figure it out. Let the ethics committee figure out if there's anything to be done, which usually the ethics committee doesn't do that much. And then if they get convicted of crime, then they have to be either expelled from the House or resign, which is usually what happens. So maybe that's what they're waiting to let play out here. Of course, George Santos is kind of in a class of his own as far as the kind of myths, mistruths, lies that he's had about his resume. But when it comes to the really serious issues that could be finance, campaign finance issues, where did he get all of this money that he said he earned over the 2 years that between when he filed for Congress in 2020 and 2022? A lot of unknowns about that. And it'll be very interesting to see what his committee assignments are. Is he on, just maybe one or two really like kind of not that important committees? That's sort of what I would be expecting. There's been so much really criticism of Republicans for not placing people on committees that it would be surprising to me if they did not at least put him on something. And they have not asked him to resign after everything that's come out about him so far. Obviously, McCarthy did need his vote for speaker. And that's, of course, not something that leadership will ever want to admit, but that's a very real dynamic. And every Republican that I've talked to said that if there was a 40-seat majority, it would be a much different story.
So you're saying they just want to put him on small business and forget about him?
If he's on small business, I'm going to say you predicted it.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the risk of insulting someone's subject issue interest, what would those committees be that they would put an unattractive member?
Well, I could tell you it would not be judiciary. It would not be oversight. It would not be appropriations. It would not be ways and means. It would probably be something like small business.
It would not be energy and commerce.
Probably nothing having to do with finances at this point.
That would be poetic justice. We put him on the budget committee because he's good at doing his campaign finances like a penny under the limit or whatever the heck he's accused of. Emily, the last question here is, you're covering Congress at maybe in modern history, the most exciting time. We had a kerfuffle on the floor that we discussed between Mike Rogers and Matt Gaetz. We had a historic speaker vote coming about. We have the Catch Me If You Can, George Santos coming up in Congress. We have a bunch of these select committees. Some are dealing with serious topics, some maybe aren't. Is there anything else that we have left out that we really should be focusing on aside from the budget and everything else we've discussed? Or anything that you're looking forward to, particularly coming up in this Congress?
We've covered so much. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head right now. One thing I will say, it's going to be interesting to see how the Republican Study Committee, the largest conservative caucus in the House, interacts with the rest of the caucus right now. Kevin Hearn, who's a Oklahoma Republican, he made his fortune with McDonald's franchises in Oklahoma, is leading that caucus this year for this Congress. He's kind of a very different character than Jim Banks, who was the chairman for the last Congress, who was very public facing. He was very media friendly. He was very, always letting us know what was going on. And Kevin Hern is a little bit more wonky. He has been very involved in crafting this Republican Study Committee budget for the last 2 years. That might be kind of at the center of a lot of things in this Congress. Ralph Norman, one of the McCarthy holdouts, referenced the RSC budget specifically when he was explaining his opposition to McCarthy, trying to get a balanced budget passed. And also, very interesting thing is when Republicans started voting for Kevin Hern to be Speaker rather than Kevin McCarthy. And I might have to double check, but I think if you're not counting Donald Trump, might be the only other candidate that people were voting for on the floor who is not a Freedom Caucus member and more of a potentially theoretically viable candidate. And he also did not specifically rule out ever running for Speaker if McCarthy had faltered. So that was a little bit interesting. Of course, he did support McCarthy on every single ballot, but it could be interesting to see how that committee interacts with the rest of the conference this year.
What a fun answer.
Emily, do you think that it's important that a speaker has a pre-existing public profile? Because we were talking about this, me and Justin, about how Hern and McHenry and some of the other names that were mentioned were people that were completely unknown to the public or almost never in news media. And so they would have been really surprising choices. We kind of went through this in the UK with Penny Mordaunt when her name was coming up, and only 10% of the public had heard of her, but she was first in the betting odds to become the next prime minister. Does it matter if someone is obscure and unknown? How important is it that they have a public profile before they ascend to a position like that?
I think it's pretty important. If for nothing else other than like a correlation, sort of like anything else, if you're running for a position for Congress or for Senate or for anything for president. I mean, part of this thing that helped Donald Trump when he first ran is that everybody knew who he was. Everybody can picture this guy. But of course, the Speaker of the House is a position that's picked by not the public, but by the members of the House. So in theory, you could have somebody who's lesser known. That would have been a very interesting scenario to see if McCarthy hadn't have pulled it out. But part of the reason why McCarthy did pull it out and why the speaker is so well known is because usually members choose somebody who is good at speaking to the media. McCarthy is not a super eloquent public speaker, but he does a lot, and he does a lot of fundraising. He's very personable. He knows members. He gets to know them. He's done so much with crafting the strategy for where they're going in each election cycle. And that takes, like any politician, a big part of that is who you know and how much you remember and knowing what other people's wants and needs are. And if you do that enough, you're probably going to get to be known pretty well, or at least rise up. Some of the people who have risen up have not necessarily sought it. Some of them have. McCarthy is one of those who always seems to be kind of interested in it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Emily.